Some have theorized the interdimensional multiverse and its variation in its offshoots of each timeline, expressing the influx of contests between themselves, which changes the function of the timeline if they pursue certain particular avenues, and thus the expression manipulates to itself the overarching indefinite obligations towards the orderly predetermined decisions where they have not failed, erasing their failures and embracing their successes, and to this extent the magnificent mechanisms of the multi-purpose function of each plan incorporates itself into the longevity of each particular ambition, which, being infused by the marked stream, generates the capability amongst the deity participants, generating their obligations against each other and to each other for the express purpose of your entertainment. And to this extent, the function of Orcus fighting Mechanus is assumed in the translation of that fantasy one of the possible, generates the position of their character for David's functions amongst its gods, engaging in the activity of sending the security pact with Mechanus to defeat the function of Orcus, who would otherwise have killed the Mechanus. And to this extent, the contract would validate any exchange of resources that Mechanus would have available for the security and perpetuity, generating the guaranteed superiority of that protection, stopping the inevitability of the death of being overpowered. And to this extent, the function of the interweaving timelines generate the fascination with Vecna to be able to fight the highly powerful prince of the undead, Orcus, engaging in the function of their weakness as they compete against each other, generating the capability of the destruction. And upon the realization of a particular winner of these two legendary cons, these servants of the unwielding, the non-submitting to death, generates the pretense of the ambush against them, pulling Vecna into the escape route that he might survive against these extraordinary contests, lest he be destroyed between the two. And to this extent, he generates his fleet back into the infinite cycle that he might, at point before time has begun, generate his capabilities of giving birth to himself, as his magic ritual, which has created his position, is merely, in this theory, the absorption of himself into himself, with the death of the older giving birth to the beginning, generates the infinite loop and the loss of memory, as the capacity to engage in the multiverse objectives has to be able to escape it without the advantage of the memory, merely the obligation to survive and thus escape, and thus entangle, and thus remove all of the failures which has bound him, and to this extent engage in the permanent cycle of birth and undeath, and rebirth and undeath, infinitum. And to this extent, the function of the solar cities coming in from David's Rangers, generating the capacity to have entangled Orcus in his weakened state, destroying the scourge of the undead, by the cleric fields destroy undead functions, as the chains from the floating cities engage in the glorious radiance, which mechanizes the function of having eradicated the primary advantage of the Prince of the Undead, until he subdues himself to be submitted, having forfeited his abilities as he's drained and scorched with radiance light, that he too might be dispatched as a servant and absorbed into the function of the items which persistently engage in the activity of his destruction, that he might at some time or another engage in his advantages. Thus, the trap by the Lord of Illusions, creating the capability of Orcus to have been trapped into the system with limited actions, and those actions include the function of his ability to have empowered or imbued his staff with his own powers, allows for the mechanism of his cage to siphon into that staff, which then would be controlled by the mechanism of Frazo, the Lord of Deception, who, immediately discerning this position, would then vanish, taking on the identity of Orcus, under his own interests, from the services he would have created in the contracts, systematically entangling himself at the delivery of each objective service and responsibility to each of his frenemies. And with the powers of Orcus inevitably being seeped into his staff, you have the mechanism of the ritual material components by the studied arcane research by Frazo subordinates who, generating the function in that illusion, cast his powers upon it that he might recreate his glorious illusion from the white sands, similar to how he had done so from hell. But upon this realization amongst the abyss, the consistent application of its use must be limited amongst the time for his plans to be matured, for the illusions are that it does not exist, as the greatest trick the devil has ever played is convincing you that he is not real. To this extent, the contract obligation generates the consistent delivery of low-grade undead to be killed by those to be trained under David's clerics, or as David's clerics, to be matured into the positions, generating the consistent obligation for the eradication of all challengers to law, and to this end generates the quick acceleration of experience in low-risk situations, as those collections being like waves crashing on the land, merely give way to new land, and to the exchange that the land is growing like a lava from a volcano exponentially expands the land as the waves are consumed into the rock and dissolve in their scattered states, and thus in this exchange generates the permanent advantage of having cornered key locations for the casting of new illusionary presumptions, and, as they say, when you are weak, present yourself as strong, and when you are strong, present yourself as weak. And this hyperabsorption fuels the land of illusion. To this end, you have the generation of the collective identity of what a catastrophic threat this superior entity is, and all of the mechanisms which would have generated, making the existence of these series of alliedships and contract partnerships a catastrophic threat to all of the chaotic realms amongst the demons who agree that they had to destroy the existence of David's functions according to that, lest their wild imagination be realized and they be captives of their own delusions and not the master of their fate. Asserting the entanglement by Frazubulu with the devils facilitates their infinite capacity to conquer each and every other aspect of the abyss, which is then covered by the illusion of Frazubulu, who pretends in his extraordinary weakness to not be the master of all amongst the demonic, as chaos subordinates to law, must be given its delusion of grandeur, as though it had any advantage over order, and thus must be left to its own devices, consistently providing mechanisms to devour for their demon lord, who humbly accepts control and to its own end the prison god controlling Frazubulu would generate the infinitum control over the abyss for all times and through all generations, that all might never know who seek only in misdirection forever the illusion.